Good day and welcome to the Hudson Institute. I'm Timothy Walton. I'm a senior fellow in the Hudson Institute's Center for Defense Concepts and Technology, and today we'll be discussing aerial refueling. Aerial refueling is one of the U.S. military's most important strategic advantages. It allows U.S. forces to project power globally in defense of American interests and helps U.S. forces conduct dynamic operational concepts that can help keep adversaries off balance. However, what's historically been a U.S. strategic strength and advantage now risks becoming a major weakness. The U.S. Air Force's aerial refueling fleet of tanker aircraft is very old, and it also faces major threats, principally from the People's Republic of China, on the ground and in the air. There's also challenges where stiff budgetary headwinds lead many to question whether the U.S. Air Force can field the tanker fleet that the nation needs. Brian Clark, who's our Center for Defense Concepts and Technology director, and I published a report on the topic titled Resilient Aerial Refueling, Safeguarding the U.S. Military's Global Reach. It can be found on our website and linked to this event page. In the report, we assessed the Department of Defense's aerial refueling enterprise and concluded that it would likely face challenges supporting U.S. strategy and operational concepts against China at scale. However, we do think there are opportunities to address these shortfalls this decade if the Department of the Defense makes some investments in the areas of surface infrastructure, command control and communications, and then the tanker aircraft themselves. To discuss this critical topic and the challenges and opportunities facing the aerial refueling enterprise, we're joined by three of Washington's top aerospace experts. To start off on your left, Mark Gunzinger is the Director of Future Concepts and Capabilities at the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies. Mark retired as a colonel in the U.S. Air Force, where he was a B-52 pilot and served on the air staff. He also served as Director for Defense Transformation, Force Planning, and Resources on the National Security Staff in the White House, and was appointed Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Force Transformation and Resources. Mark's been a leading voice on the plans needed to counter anti-access area denial capabilities, including his co-authoring the proposed air-sea battle concept and multiple works on long-range strike, air and missile defense, and munitions. Todd Harrison, then on your right in the center, is Senior Vice President and Head of Research at Meta Aerospace. He recently joined Meta after spending 13 years at various think tanks, most recently at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Todd teaches classes at Johns Hopkins and George Washington Universities. He's a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations, a member of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Advisory Committee on Commercial Remote Sensing, and a member of the Defense News Advisory Board. Prior to his work at think tanks, Todd worked for consultancies and startups and has been a captain in the U.S. Air Force Reserves. And then here, closest to me, is John J.V. Venable, who's a senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation. JV is a 25-year veteran in the U.S. Air Force who during his career served as a forward air controller and fighter pilot. Before retiring as a colonel, he served as principal advisor and briefer to the Chief of Staff of the Air Force. He participated in 3 combat operations and served as commander of multiple celebrated units, including the Thunderbirds and the 379th Air Expeditionary Group at Al Udeid Air Base, which supported operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, including aerial refueling. Before joining Heritage, he was also vice president of a research and development company specializing in explosives detection. Thank you all for joining us today. It's a real pleasure to have you, and I'm looking forward to the conversation, as I'm sure everyone is as well. To start off, I'd just like to give each of you an opportunity to share what you view sort of some of the principal challenges, opportunities, state of the aerial refueling enterprise, and if you'd like, we could start with Mark and work our way over.
Sure. Thanks, Tim. Very nice introduction. Appreciate it. Thank you for coming today. So our tanker force is old, and it's much smaller than the tanker force that our Air Force operated during the Cold War era. And I think your reports capture that very, very nicely. Just to mention one statistic, the last KC-135, which is an aircraft that was designed originally in the 1950s, but the last KC-135 air refueling tanker will probably leave our force, replaced by KC-46 or another new aircraft, when it hits the point of about 70 years old. Now, I'm a B-52 pilot. That boggles my mind. My aircraft are pretty old, but that is a topper. So when I approach questions on what's the most important thing to do to modernize our forces, be it air refueling tankers, airlifters, or combat aircraft? I think of four things. So this is kind of what I'm going to talk about today during our discussion. The first thing is what's the evolving threat environment? And we know that it's increasingly contested, especially since our Department of Defense has shifted towards deterring and, if necessary, defeating great power aggression in highly contested threat environments that are not conducive to non-stealth aircraft operating in those areas. The second is, what are the operating concepts for our air forces? How are they going to deploy, where are they going to deploy to, and how are they going to actually fight and win over a great power aggressor like China or Russia? If you don't know that, then you can't really start to prescribe what kinds of capabilities and how many tankers our force might need in the future. And the third is, what's the mix of our future air force? Does it consist primarily of very long-range capabilities that need minimal refueling to do their missions? Or is it more skewed towards shorter-range capabilities? Well, and that's exactly the case today. It is skewed towards shorter-range capabilities that require a great deal of air refueling capacity. And finally, technology. What's the state of the art of the technology that could support the development of replacement tankers? Because that can really open up options. It's not necessarily always going to be a commercial derivative, because in the future it might be an unmanned capability, a capability that has some survivability in those contested areas that could allow it to refuel a little closer in to an adversary, which would be a force multiplier from the perspective of our force at large. So that's stage setter.
Great.
Over to you.
Thank you, Todd.
Yeah, I think, it's great that you guys have, really studied this topic. Great report that you've released on this. I'm glad that we could all be here to discuss refueling, because it's so important to the future capabilities of the Air Force. When I think about what's needed in the future fleet in terms of aerial refueling, the first thing is capacity, right? We already have a capacity shortfall today. The Air Force is not able to meet the demand for tankers, just steady state peacetime demand. They're not able to meet it. And so we've got to do something, to improve the capacity of the force. Part of that has to do with the aging fleet. That the KC-135s, they cannot fly as much as we would like. The mission capable rates are not where you see comparable aircraft in the commercial sector, for sure. So I think that's a huge part of it. Now, in understanding what's the capacity that we need in the future, I think, Mark was exactly right that it all starts with understanding what's your concept of operations, what's the mix of aircraft that the tankers will be supporting, right? And that all drives what you need. And I hope that we will get away from this idea that you can boil all of that down into a single number, right? 479 tankers in the fleet. These simplified metrics, they don't work. What we need to understand is what are the broad set of metrics you have to look at in your tanker fleet, including number of booms, offload capacity, offload at range, right? All of these different metrics that go into that. That's what your CONOP should be informing. And then you should design a future tanker fleet that will meet that basket of metrics to serve the force well in the future. So, we got to get away from this idea of a static number, a single number that you can boil it all down to. Second major factor we've got to be considering is affordability. And that's part of the reason we don't have the capacity that we need today. Is that, as you pointed out in your study, the operating cost of the tankers keeps going up. I think it's 3% a year, right? In the long run, that prices us out of the ability to, afford the fleet that we need to support the needs of the nation. So, we've got to be looking at affordability as a major factor in the future tanker fleet. And then, also third factor, that we've got to be looking at is capabilities. And part of that is building in things like, command and control type capabilities. Tankers should be nodes in battle networks. They have potential as sensing nodes as well. A lot of ancillary missions that you can put into tankers that actually end up making our overall battle networks more resilient. Not that you ever want to be dependent on tankers to do all of that, but if they are extra nodes in that network and they're going to be there anyway, then that just makes your battle networks that much more resilient in the future. So, I think we've got to take all of these factors into account when thinking about what do we need in a KCY, the next competition, or not a competition maybe, that'll be coming up, or a KCZ down the road.
Thank you, Todd. JB, please.
Well, Tim, you and Brian put out a great report, and one of the things that is really wonderful about it is you brought this requirement and this gap that we're facing back to the forefront of the conversation. So congratulations and thanks.
Thank you.
The Air Force has been trying to recapitalize its fleet for the last 21 years. It has started this process that we're going through right now in 2001, and for the first probably 10 to 11 years of that, you had really poor leadership in the process and a very badly executed acquisition plan that caused starts and stops that have manifested to where we are right now. The goodness in that was that they developed a kind of a three-phased plan to address the things that both Gonzo and Todd brought up, which is capacity requirements and future capability needs, right? And what we're going to need in the future. And the three-phase process you all address in your paper is KCX, KCY, and KCZ, which is that future tanker that is going to be able to go, hopefully, and do what we need to do in a very radar-intensive and SAM-intensive environment. We're in the middle of KCX right now, and the execution of that has gone incredibly poorly. We are dealing with a faltering commercial delivery process that was supposed to be low risk that has turned out to be high risk because of failures in the systems that were supposed to make this a leading edge type of environment where you have remote vision systems that allow the boomer to go up front as opposed to be laying in the back and the likes. And that process has exacerbated the need. The opportunity that we have right now is to finish and fix KCX without abandoning the competition associated with KCY to get that next increment of tankers right and drive the cost down as much as we can while getting as much fuel and as many booms as we can downrange. And then have that start delivering at the end of this decade while we're developing KCZ. And I think that's the opportunity, and I hope that the service doesn't lose this off of what we see as potentially contractual favoritism, the ease of which to continue a process that has been broken for the last 10 years. And so looking forward to the discussion ahead, but this has been an episodic start, and let's see how we go down the future.
Thanks, JV. Appreciate it. Wanted to ask you a follow-up if I could. You had an excellent event that you hosted at the Heritage Foundation a few weeks ago with Secretary of the Air Force Frank Kendall.
Right.
During that event, some of the themes you brought out are the readiness of the current force in terms of fighter aircraft, tankers. How do you view some of those challenges, I think, affecting aerial refueling and affecting, I think, more broadly, maybe the ability of the U.S. Air Force and Department of Defense to meet its needs?
Well, competency, because of the lack of sorties across the board, has waned. Fighter pilots coming to that side need around 13 sorties a month in order to sustain their day-to-day routine. And part of that routine is going out, hitting tankers, taking fuel off the boom, and then leaving, to where it becomes rote. It becomes so part of your daily routine. It's like breathing. You don't think about going to a tanker. In the Persian Gulf, there were sorties where I went to the boom 13 times over a course of a 12-hour sortie. And so you just don't think about it. You're concentrating on the mission. Well, today, when pilots are getting 4 to 5 sorties a month, they're not going to the tanker nearly as often. And so that creates a problem behind the boom. And now with the RVS system that this current remote vision system that the KCX is, or KCX, which is the KC-46, is currently having problems with, you have a built-in challenge for the boomer to actually make contact with a fighter who is not going to be nearly as stable as he was in previous years with more sorties. And so this, as an operational paradigm, becomes very problematic, and you increase your potential risk. And I'm talking about on a day-to-day sortie basis where you may damage an aircraft, but if you get into really bad weather and you get into situations where there is no sun, like in deep clouds, in rain, you may actually have problems refueling to the point where you end up actually canceling or aborting missions that are supposed to go downrange and hit targets. So the long-range impact of this is significant. The fix that the Boeing is coming up with is not supposed to be fielded for the RVS and the boom until 2024, and that is not going to be air-to-air tested. They're not going to test this system before they accept the fix. And that is going to lead to potentially future problems operationally.
Okay. Thank you very much, JB. I think it's also fair to say, right, that the U.S. Transportation Command, AMC, have opened up the number of receivers that could be supported by the KC-46. I think they approved maybe 97% of the fleet, but there still are continuing challenges with, right, that 3% hasn't been approved. And then more broadly, I think that the point you raise of RVS 2.0 will need to address sort of those more challenging environments where there's more turbulence, more obfuscation, obscuration in different ways.
So Tim, if I could
Please.
add a caveat to that, the approval for that 97% of the inventory is peacetime. It's still not downrange. And so what that means is the remaining fleet of tankers, which right now we fielded something like 65 KC-46s. By the end of this year, it'll be 75. By 2024, it'll be 105, which means you're decreasing the other fleet of tankers, which will be KC-135s. If you end up having a problem where those tankers cannot go downrange and cannot refuel, now you've taken a fleet of 486 down to a fleet of 386. And so that operational impact, not day-to-day peacetime mission constraints, but the operational impact will be significant.
Thank you. Please.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in. I'm going to say something a bit contrarian, right? It's certainly not popular among the Air Force, but it's worth pointing out that the KC-46 program, for all of its problems, and you know, I don't want to minimize what JV was talking about at all. There are many issues with the remote vision system that still need to be corrected. But for all its problems, the acquisition program I would actually chalk up as a success, because you go back to when the contract was let. Right? And that was a time when there were huge concerns about cost, right? And in any acquisition program, you can optimize for cost, schedule, or performance, not all three. And at that time, we were optimizing acquisition programs for cost. They put that program on a fixed cost contract. It's, you know, government terms, fixed price. Really, there was a cost share to a certain point of cost overrun, and then after they reached that cap, which they reached very quickly, then 100% of the cost overrun was on the contractor, was on Boeing. And as long as the Air Force stuck to the contract and did not try to modify it, Boeing was stuck with all of those cost overruns. And Boeing paid a huge price on this. I would argue that is a fantastic success story that needs to be repeated more often, that the government should not be left holding the bag. The government should not have to assume all the risk when they, you know, are building something new and a contractor says they can do it for cheap. The contractor should bear the risk of that, and in this case, they did. Right? Now, did it meet our performance specs? Did it meet our schedule? No, it did not, but we did not optimize the program for that. For what the program was optimized for, it achieved that. Now, I think we're looking back at it, and the pendulum has shifted in defense acquisitions, and it is much more in favor of getting things faster and getting higher performance systems. So they are coming back. They're going to crack open that contract. They're going to, you know, rewrite some of their requirements, and now the government will be taking the cost risk for that. That's a decision that, you know, program managers and acquisition officials have to make, but understand that now the risk is being put on the government to do that. And you'll get exactly what you want in the end, because you'll pay Boeing until they finally make whatever that you want. The other thing I would point out about the remote vision system is we've got to view this as really an interim step. Ultimately, what you want to get to is autonomous boom operations so that you can eventually get to an unmanned tanker or a remotely operated tanker, right? And so I think that this is one of the technological steps along that evolution, starting with a remote vision system, eventually remote, operation that is maybe a human in the loop, maybe, fully autonomous, but eventually getting to that point to an unmanned tanker.
No, thanks, Todd. I think excellent series of comments. I think it's absolutely true. I guess the Air Force or the Boeing has incurred a lot of that cost risk and brought down, I guess, the technological risk over time. There have been delays, which obviously have been problematic just because the existing fleet is very expensive. So it's increasingly challenging to operate that, as you noted before as well. But sort of in theory, maybe some of that technological risk has been brought down over time, which would position the Air Force better if it decided to go that direction in terms of the future tanker. Wanted to ask a slightly different question that builds off of your point, Todd, on the number of tankers. So you had mentioned sort of a single metric is problematic. It's challenging in terms of trying to pick what are the best metrics. Perhaps I'll start with Mark, and then we can work our way over. But Mark, you've written a lot on force sizing constructs and the size required for the Department of Defense, the U.S. Air Force. The U.S. Transportation Command had set a requirement for 479 tankers in their mobility capabilities requirement study. The U.S. Air Force has proposed reducing the size of that force to 455. The number of tankers isn't always the perfect metric, as Todd was pointing out, but at the same time, if we want to distribute our tankers temporally, geographically, we need a certain number of them. How do you view that sort of the risk in this numbers, and what's the best way for the Air Force to assess, and Congress, I guess, to assess what that requirement should be?
I think there's significant risk in the numbers. Now, I'll tell you why. We started off by talking about operating concepts. If you don't know how you're going to deploy and fight in the future, if you're still formulating that for a fight with China in the Indo-Pacific and a fight with Russia, possibly in Europe, if you don't know that, it's hard for you to define the size and shape of the force you need. The Air Force is still defining that. I think that's a critical step to determining its future requirements. What the Air Force is doing now is doing out of necessity, back to the budget word. Now, I specifically didn't mention budget when I laid out the four things when I started. You have to consider budget, but I would say a better measure would be cost per effect, if you would. Because too many of these kinds of discussions start with cost, and then they go to program specifics. My jet's better than your jet, no it's not, and so forth and so on. You really need to start with the operating concepts. How do we size and shape the force to the future? And then what kind of capacity do we need in our air refueling fleet? Where should they be postured, and so forth? All the answers flow from that. So when you take a look at our force sizing construct for the Department of Defense, it's to fight one major war, deter a second lesser aggressor like Iran or North Korea elsewhere, sustain nuclear deterrence, and that is additive in terms of requirements for our tankers, and of course, support homeland defense. Again, an additive requirement. When you add all those numbers up, in the future, I think it's going to drive a much higher need for number of tankers and capacity. And I also think because of the threat environment we're going to operate in, which we can talk about later if you wish, it's going to be a different mix of tankers in the future, because I agree with Todd on that. So I think the current force is high risk. It is driven more by budget. The Air Force wants to take down more fighters because, frankly, it doesn't have air crews and it doesn't have excess funding they can use to shift over and build the KC-46 force. So it has to take it out of height. And the Air Force, of course, its budget is the smallest of any other service. Well, it's smaller than the Army's and the Navy's budget, and it has been for decades. So I'm not surprised they're having that issue.
Oh, thanks, Mark. Todd, over to you. I think you had some sort of interesting ways that build off of Mark's comments of what's the best way of looking at metrics for assessing the force, and then JV, I know you've written also on the requisite size of the force. So.
Yeah, no, I think Mark is hitting on the right points, and ultimately it is about the effects that you're delivering, right? And the effects that you need to deliver for the O plans that you're supporting and your concept of operations and how you're going to fight those. So yeah, you got to be looking at what are the right effects, and then how do we measure that? How do we measure that in terms of the tanker forces that we're providing? So in some cases, it's going to be you need a certain number of booms in the air. You got to refuel a certain number of aircraft, certain amount of time. So fuel offload rate, things like that. There are going to be CONOPS where you're going to have to deliver fuel over great distances. So then it's offload at a certain range, right? And then that gets into, what's the fuel efficiency of the tanker itself, and it's flying out, what is its capacity, and then what can it support in terms of offload. I think it also then drives you to look at potentially, different CONOPS for how you employ tankers if you had different capabilities in your future tanker force. Looking at, hey, maybe KCZ should be something like a smaller, a medium-sized tanker that is uncrewed, that can just loiter and can be refueled itself. And then your other tankers are basically just bridges that refuel the KCZs that are operating closer to the battle space and just stay orbiting for long periods of time, something like that. So I think we've really got to get into the details in the analysis to figure out, well, what are those key metrics that we want to see in our future tanker force, and then start thinking about what are the technical solutions and what are the most affordable technical solutions, because affordability ultimately is going to limit your capacity. And so, but you've got to start with really what are the right metrics for what do we need. I haven't seen that come out of the Air Force yet. So, I'm hopeful that if they're not working on it now, they need to be working on it, and that they will do that before they proceed much further.
Do you think it's fair to say also, Todd, that the metrics, the right metrics for, let's say, a conflict, especially a large conflict, are maybe slightly different from the other set of metrics for like peacetime competition phase, and it could be useful to use a family of metrics.
You need both, right? And you need that whole basket of metrics to understand, what you're actually going to need in your future tanker force, and then understanding where you're going to take risk. Because, Mark, you were talking about what are we actually sizing our military to do? Is it one major operation? One decisively defeat and one deter? Or is it two decisively defeat, or 1.5, or something? Or how much overlap in time do you have between those? All of that gets down to, ultimately what do you need in your total capacity, but then what risk are you taking and where are you taking it, right? And we need to be able to understand that. And then understand, for the tanker fleet, how can you mitigate some of those risks, even if you're not going to have a large enough force? What could you do to mitigate some of the risk?
Yeah. JV, you've also written a bit on the topic of risk and sizing of the force. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, this is like when we talk about risk, it's like taking your 5th or 6th mortgage on your home. We have doubled down on risk so often and so frequently we've lost track of how deeply we are into
at high
this.
interest rates now too.
Right, at very high interest rates. So this is really a great conversation, and Todd's point about this being an acquisition success is true financially, right? But operationally, it has been a failure. And this is one where that failure may only cost us time, but that time window is one where we become very, very vulnerable. So the historic studies that the services have done have basically all been attuned to the time of an administration. So as the Trump administration was coming in, and the DoD could actually see a conservative push towards a higher rate of defense, the Air Force did a study called the Air Force We Need. And it was based on the 2018 National Defense, NDS, National Defense Strategy. And in that study, they actually looked at this as a clean slate. And what they found was that we were a bunch of tankers short of what the requirement would be for a great power competition, particularly against China. And that unconstrained review said that we were 14 squadrons short, which equates to about 210 tankers. At the time, we had about 480, and so this adds up to about 690. 690 tankers is what that study revealed. And so the Air Force almost immediately started backing away from that study. This is what we need, but this is what we can kind of afford. And so now you're starting to see more and more studies and more distance, and none of the studies are being released. And so they're saying, hey, we're doing a study on fighter capacity and what we need now, but they're not releasing the results of those studies because that would force them to backtrack based on budgets. And so when I've been in combat, flying combat sorties, and you go down range and you actually are in the heat of a fight, you need a boom, right? You need a boom, and when you get to that boom, it had better be free, right? And if there's a waiting period, so if there's 6 airplanes that are waiting for gas and you've run yourself out, either everybody gets off and you are allowed to go to the front of the waiting list of the airplanes that are on the wing, or you start flaming out aircraft. An F-35 carries a lot of gas. The only tanker that's going to be able to refuel downrange right now for the Navy and the Air Force is going to be the Air Force tankers, the KC-135s, the KC-10s that are left, and the KC-46s that go downrange. The time it takes to refuel off of a hose as opposed to a boom, even off of the KC-46, means that you're almost, if you're halfway out of gas for C models, Navy F-35s, it's going to take you 40 minutes to refuel at a minimum a 4-ship of aircraft. 40 minutes. And so you start doing this math, and now it doesn't become so much how much gas you have downrange, it's how many booms that you have, how many hoses that you have in order to get on and off the tanker and go out and do your business. And right now, for the next 8 to 10 years, until the KC-46 comes up, we're going to be sub 400 in operational, fully operational capable aircraft. When I say that, you're going to, if the fight comes, you're going to push all of the KC-46s downrange. All of these restrictions are going to go away, but now you're taking, no kidding, operational risk. And if guys come to the boom and they're out of gas and they need to be stuck with the boom through the RVS system, and they're in the weather and the RVS doesn't have the depth perception required to hit the tanker, to hit the fighters the first time, you're going to start dropping very expensive jets that we've minimized based on risk. So this is a circular conversation that all comes back to, it's a balancing act between budgetary constraints always, but operational requirements first and foremost. And when we start sacrificing that to meet the budget, we are actually putting our servicemen and women at great risk.
There's some great points. JV, Mark, you want to
You hit it on the head, JV. Tim and I led a sister study to the Air Force is the Air Force we need study, as required by Congress and handed into Congress, and we had very similar findings. Actually, we recommended a much larger force of the Air Force because we said only air power can begin the blunt operation against a Chinese invasion, can get into theater and start fighting night one, and deter credibly in Europe and begin operations if necessary if someone like Russia takes advantage of our military being absorbed in conflict in the Pacific. Only air power can do that in the time frame needed to blunt and then stop those invasions. But the point was, the Air Force lacked the resources to fund the Air Force we need, the 386 operational squadrons. That study was required by Congress to be done without being constrained by cost. What do you need Air Force to execute the National Defense Strategy, the things that we mentioned, the force planning construct, at a moderate level to risk? That was the number. The Air Force has never approached the resources it needs to do that. So everything in between what it needs and what it can afford is risk, and that risk is considerable. So when I talked about the tanker force being a high risk, our Air Force is a high-risk force. It falls short of what's needed to fight one major peer conflict across the board.
And that, please, Todd.
Yeah, no, I have to get on my budget soapbox here and say, I'm going to say this.
I know.
Anytime you do a study that is resource unconstrained, it is not useful. because there's no plan to back it up and there's no plan to have a plan. And I told the folks at the time that were doing the study in the Air Force, like, that's fine, you can do your pie in the sky because, hey, if I'm resource unconstrained, I'd like 1 million tankers. That will buy down some level of risk, but don't give me some sky high number that is resource unconstrained alone. Give me a realistic number and give me a dollar amount you need to get to that. Do a resource-informed study as part of it. That then becomes actionable, right? And I think that's where the 386 squadrons that they came out with, it fell flat because it was like, that's great. Well, first of all, they left it at squadrons. They didn't put number of tails, right? You were left to deduce that
Classified
yourself.
report did have that detail.
Yeah, but the one that went,
Fair
that
point.
was out in the public.
Yep.
And then it's like, okay, well, so did you build your budget to this? No. Well, what budget would be required for this? Well, we didn't do that. And, it's like, okay, well, this is not very helpful then.
I think it's also worth pointing out that the Air Force We Need study focused on a two conflicts, major adversaries
No, it
simultaneously.
focused on one.
One, okay.
One and
It
a
was
half.
and deter elsewhere, but a lesser aggressor, not Russia. It was the 2018 NDS force sizing construct that they adhered to. And I'll tell you, we ask our servicemen and women to go to war, and you have to ask, do you have everything you need to fight and win? I never want to hear back from them, well, we're going to war with what we can afford. I'm sorry, that doesn't.
I think
I don't think it's a dichotomy like that.
Got
Do
it.
you have everything you need? If you don't, what does it cost?
Yeah,
Tell me.
exactly.
What does it cost?
And the cost in the current case is going to be attrition, lives lost,
Yep.
and maybe failure.
But the Air Force leadership is not doing the country a service if they just say, well, we need this many, but we have no plan to get there.
I'd like to move the conversation forward a little bit. I think we've captured really well
It was fun.
The fact that be it one major adversary in deterring another one or two, 479 tankers is already insufficient. And there's probably a demand for more tankers than that just to meet that one true adversary like China in a conflict. And so going down to 455 would incur major risk. I want to ask sort of another type of risk question to Mark, please, of how do you view the Air Force changing some of its operating concepts, and what are some of the threats facing Air Forces in a potential conflict with China that should shape how we operate and design the tanker fleet?
So very simply, in the past, we concentrated our forces. We concentrated in a handful of main operating bases in the Pacific and in Europe and then elsewhere because it was highly efficient and there were no threats to our bases. And there are very few threats to our tanker operations and, frankly, our aircraft. Today, both those things have changed. Our bases are at risk. We're going to have to fight our forces into theater. We're going to have to fight our bases because they're going to be under assault from long-range missiles and cruise missiles and air attacks, and unmanned aircraft for that matter. And our tankers are going to be at risk from long-range air-to-air interceptors as well as very long-range surface-to-air threats, some of which are naval-based. So our tankers aren't going to be able to base on the periphery of an adversary, as we did in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere when we fought Iraq twice. They're probably not going to be able to base along the first island chain and be secure. They're going to have to back out to the second island chain. That takes a toll in terms of number of sorties you can crank and the air refueling offload capacity the force is going to need. Also, those tankers aren't going to be able to close within 100 or 50 miles, 100 miles of the border of an adversary like China. Secretary Kendall said at the event you mentioned a couple of weeks ago that we have the best military in the world until you're about 1,000 miles from the coastline of China. And then the pendulum swings. And by the way, that distance is growing every year. So our operating concepts are evolving towards doing air refueling operations 800 to 1,000 miles off the coastline of China, maybe 400 to 500 off Kaliningrad and so forth in a fight with Russia. So that again limits the range of our shorter range capabilities like fighters and so forth after refueling. That's a huge limiter, which is why I agree with Todd. We have to look at different operating concepts and different technologies for our air refueling force in the future where we might be able to stand in and conduct operations a little closer.
Thanks, Mark. I think that's a really good segue to one of the questions that I think interests very many sort of you here today and watching online is the topic of future tanker design. The Air Force is right now buying its KCX tankers, which is the KC-46A. It's buying 179 of them, but it's planning on buying a follow-on KC-Y. And right now, I think in the next couple of months, if I understand it correctly, the Air Force will make a decision as to whether to hold a competition or not, and continue to buy KC-46s. I'd like to just ask each of you, maybe I can start with JV, for some of your brief thoughts on what do you think are the sort of major factors that the Air Force should keep in mind as it considers whether or not to have a competition, or what that KC-Y tanker should have in terms of its performance parameters to be able to meet the mission needs?
Yeah, it's a great series of questions. So one, competition is paramount. If you don't have competition, you're not going to drive efficiencies and you're not going to drive a performance. We kind of see that in the fighter world. We kind of see that in the B-21, sole source provider, right? And we're seeing that now with the KC-46. I think Todd mentioned it earlier, or maybe it was Gonzo, about the design of the RVS being basically an incremental step to go towards basically no boomer, an AI system being able to refuel aircraft. That's absolutely true, and the competition for this last KCX, that the KC-46 won, was the MRTT. It's a European designed tanker. And they have an RVS system that's been working for several years. And this year, they're going to actually test it and certify it for AI, non-boom operated, basically automated system for daytime ops. And then next year, they're going to certify that system for nighttime operations. And so the competition in this particular fight is way ahead. The one that lost the KCX is way ahead in that process. The KC-Y competition that we're looking at next, the Secretary in our engagement said that they're actually looking hard at this now, but thinking about just extending the contract that KCX is under and basically giving that to Boeing for KC-Y. The challenge is twofold. One is if we buy at a minimum level of aircraft, so we buy to the budget that we can afford, which we're doing across the board, we actually have to rely on our ability to produce things rapidly in a time of war. And right now, we would have one company that could deliver tankers. If we could bring the folks who build the MRTT, which is Lockheed and a consortium from Europe, if we could bring them into the United States and have them start producing tankers here, that would be two companies that could design, build, and field viable tankers for the future. And so for me, in the short term, this competition is really important. I'm not saying that the MRTT and the Lockheed variant of the next tanker would win KC-Y, but I'm saying the competition is key to bringing the price point down to a point where the efficiencies go up. The KC-46 was delayed absolutely in acquisition, but you had production problems. You had quality control problems that were very amateurish out of Boeing throughout this process that continued to delay this program of fielding fighters. Competition is good, and I think we ought to bring it back for the KC-Y.
Thanks. Todd, please.
Yeah, so I probably should have said this earlier, but full disclosure, I work at Meta Aerospace. We actually have our own fleet of aerial refueling aircraft. We offer aerial refueling as a service.
There's the answer.
Yeah, so everything. No, obviously, aerial refueling as a service is not the answer to everything, but just to be perfectly open, we have a stake, in this area as well. When it comes to the KC-Y competition, I understand where Secretary Kendall is coming from when he says, hey, maybe our requirements are not that different, and I think one of the reasons to not necessarily open it up and bring on a different type of aircraft is every time you bring a new type of aircraft into the Air Force inventory, there are all sorts of costs that come with supporting that. And there are a lot of fixed costs that go into every different unique aircraft type that you have. So this would be introducing an Airbus, A330 airframe into the fleet. And so you've got a training pipeline that goes with that. You got a maintenance pipeline that goes with that, right?
Simulators, everything.
All of it, right? And so, it doesn't make sense unless you're going to have a significant number of them. And so he's worried that, you end up kind of, splitting all your operation and maintenance dollars between two different fleets, and it's more expensive overall. There's also the argument of the learning curve effect, right? That, now you've gotten further down the learning curve with Boeing on the KC-46. You would not be as far down the learning curve, with the Airbus Lockheed offering, but you could get there. So I think the more important point is I would not have telegraphed in advance that I was not going to compete this.
Right.
Because, the next best thing to competition is the threat of competition, right? And that can really stimulate, your existing incumbent contractor to do more, work harder. So I would have kept it open. Here's what I would do going forward is I would not view this as a single decision point. Either we compete KCY or we don't. I would view it as an ongoing decision that you reevaluate every year. Right? Every year going forward, I would say, okay, at this point, do we want to go out and compete this again? If the answer is no this year, keep buying more KC-46s. Next year, let's have the same question, and let's ask ourselves, do we want to compete it now? Yes, no, what, and make a decision as you go. Because there's no timeline for when you exactly have to do this. You could put Boeing on another contract for the KC-46 with option years. And just say those option years, we'll decide as we go whether or not we're going to execute them. So I think that there are some more creative, opportunities they could explore in the interim. Now, longer term with the KCZ, I think that's where the Air Force has got some room to be more creative, to really think through what is a radically different way of operating the tankers, and radically different technology that they might be able to use in the future tanker fleet. And that's where I think it gets really interesting.
Yeah. Mark, what are your thoughts on KCY and then maybe KCZ too, or KZ?
It's pretty clear that the KCY is going to be a commercial derivative aircraft. Okay, I think we can all agree on that. I'm kind of ambivalent on which specific system the Air Force might choose, but I'll throw in one thing that hasn't been discussed yet. I'm pretty concerned with what China might do in the 2027 to 2030 timeframe. Admiral Phil Davidson said about a year ago that he could see China making a move on Taiwan and to invade and attempt to subjugate. In that time frame, and if you look at our Air Force and the other services, they're kind of reaching a nadir in force capacity around that time, including our tanker force. That creates, frankly, an opportunity. So the thing I think you also need to keep in mind is which approach could increase our offload capacity, air refueling capacity, the quickest to hit that time frame, to reduce risk for that time frame. And then I also agree with Todd. I think the fun starts when you start talking about KCZ. Is it going to be another commercial derivative, the same commercial derivative the Air Force is now buying, or something different based on a really interesting ConOps that could increase the effectiveness of not just our air refueling operations, but our combat operations as well.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of the KCZ or KZ, I'd love to get all three of your thoughts. When we conducted our study, we started off thinking that what might make sense for that KCZ was either going to be a very large tanker that could carry lots of fuel forward into the theater from a very distant base, or a small tanker that could shuttle back and forth from other ones into more contested areas and might be very low observable. And we actually found that a medium-sized tanker, especially in terms of the amount of space it takes up on the ramp, but one that had maybe better survivability characteristics, either through active defenses or passive ones, and then could stand in a little bit, was probably a more promising sweet spot. All of you have sort of examined I think, what's the art of the possible. So I'd love to ask you first, Mark.
Well, if you remember our study that we referred to, the 2018 NDAA study we actually laid out an operating concept for what we call shuttle tanker operations. We're going to need in our force large tankers with very large offloads to support our bombers, to support our airlift, to support deployment of our forces over long ranges into theater. That's a given, okay? But our force increasingly is going to fight in a very dispersed manner over very large geographic areas like the Indo-Pacific, okay? It's not going to be, well, we'll strike here, tomorrow we'll strike here. No, it's going to be a 360-degree fight. How do you refuel that distributed force? By driving these large commercial derivative tankers all over the airspace and burning up fuel and reducing their offload capacity? Or could they shuttle out to a fleet of these smaller unmanned systems that could refuel, go out, refuel, and hit that distributed force, and would have a smaller footprint or a forward basis, easier to defend and so forth? And perhaps those unmanned systems could also be somewhat low observable, a little bit more survivability, so they can penetrate 100, 200 nautical miles into contested airspace to refuel our fighters and other aircraft that are going to need gas to keep the fight going.
Yeah, but let's be realistic about how low observable we can make a tanker.
Agreed. Fair point. Fair point.
Once you drop
I just say a little bit.
a little bit, yeah. Once you drop a boom,
Right.
all bets are off, and then you're a sitting duck for several minutes while you're in sensitive operations. But point taken, if you could get a little closer and
Yeah.
have more of an element of surprise of where your tankers are going to be operating, your tanking points. That would be beneficial. But definitely, if you're thinking more and more about distributed operations for the rest of the fleet, we've got to have the ability to support distributed operations in the tanker fleet. Right. And so, it does get down to how many booms, how many hoses do you have in the air at once, right? Taking 40 minutes to refuel a 4-ship is not acceptable. And then if you've got multiple 4 ships coming in, that's going to be a mess. So yeah, a medium-sized, smaller-sized tanker, I think would definitely be advantageous in the long run. But we need to run through the analysis of all
Exactly
the ConOps, right, to determine what are the right metrics that we need to be trying to meet.
Yeah, it's a fascinating conversation. This ability to actually mask your airplane with some kind of stealth features certainly would allow you to get in somewhat closer, but so would decreasing your altitude. This ability to actually go in with a lot of gas and then continually ramp down to a point where the over-the-horizon radars can't see you because you're low. You continue to reduce your altitude. You're going to need more gas because you burn more as you go down, but then you could release the fighters or the bombers or the other assets, whatever they are, closer in toward the target. When we talk about distributed operations, and I thought that Gonzo did a great job of saying this is going to be a 360 fight, and most people think it's going to be east to west. Yeah. It's going to be all over, and we've got to absorb that. Now you're not talking about massing 12 tankers on one ramp. You're talking about actually distributing those to different locations, and so the footprint becomes less and less of an issue. But I'll come back to numbers matter. The number of tankers that will be required for a fight in a China fight is going to dwarf what we had during OIF, Operation Iraqi Freedom. And the day-to-day demand, the everyday demand for that was 280 tankers. Your paper talks about that defeat one major regional conflict is being a requirement of 200 tankers. And I think that came from several different sources. And then,
based previously on the older studies of actually defeating a North Korea Iran. So if it's actually more of a China, that 200 number could be even greater.
Oh, absolutely.
And so that 200 number is bolstered by another 100 tankers that you could use to deter in that second theater that's also in your paper. But the fight for OIF would take up almost all of that, and it would exceed that during surges. And the fight for China is going to take that much more. Kind of no matter what we do with the distributed operations, kind of no matter what we do with our assets, we're going to need more tankers. We're the only nation in the world that provides them en masse. And we service the Navy, we service the Marine Corps, We are everywhere, and we're going to need more.
And that's
No-
where
no
allies
argument.
and partners
Yeah.
have got to be part of this analysis as well. What do they contribute? What are they going to need, right? And that's what, this is where it gets to the whole concept of federated defense, that we've got to understand what are we doing, what are others doing, where are they going to rely on us for support, and where do we want to be, that key enabler of other countries to support their own self-defense. Tankers is one of the great things that we can do to actually make other countries more effective in their own militaries.
Great point.
Absolutely. Wanted to, I was going to mention it sort of now towards the end of the talk, but you already preempted it. Thank you for doing so, Todd, that you're now at Meta that provides contractor-owned, contractor-operated aircraft to support requirements. Could you just talk a little bit more, and then JV, you also wrote a bit about COCO aerial refueling in your paper, on where do you view COCO aerial refueling in terms of sort of Air Force and broader DoD demands? Is there a segment of the demands that DoD and sort of allies and partners have that could be met by COCO aerial refueling? And then do you view this as substituting for the government-owned fleet, or what's the best way of considering the role of contractor-owned operated aerial refueling?
Well, right now it's only being contracted by the Navy. So the Air Force hasn't tapped into this resource yet, maybe one day. And what it's being used for mainly is to support peacetime missions, training missions, things of that nature. Maybe you need to ferry aircraft from one place to another, right? And it's being used to augment, the capacity that can't be met by the current government fleet. And I think for the foreseeable future, that is a huge role that COCO, can play. That, the government for the foreseeable future, as we've already discussed ad nauseum here, we just don't have the capacity right now to support even our day-to-day peacetime operations, training requirements, things like that. And so that's where contractors can fill in to meet those capacity shortfalls. Going forward, I don't think you're ever going to use contractor-owned, contractor-operated aircraft at that tactical edge, right? That's not the role. That's always going to be the role.
Homeland Defense?
Yeah, well, government-owned, government-operated at the edge,
Yeah.
right? But things that
Yeah.
are in a completely benign, uncontested environment, sure. Homeland Defense, things like that. Or if you need to ferry aircraft or ferry fuel, between the homeland, and the theater, right? You can use, COCO for that. But even continuing to support ongoing training missions, even if we're engaged, in a major theater, conflict, we're still going to have all kinds of requirements back here in the U.S. So if you can leverage more of the commercial for the ongoing requirements, in the homeland, that frees up, government-owned and operated tankers that can go forward into the fight. So it effectively supplements your overall capacity. So that's what I see as kind of the vision, for how COCO can be used for aerial refueling going forward.
I love the concept, and for covering this gap, at least for the next 5 to 7 years, until KC-46 comes up and they fix the RVS system. It's a huge resource. It also would provide the service the ability to tap into that in a time of war. If you go back to World War II, there were a lot of small ships and a lot of small sailors that were out at sea that suddenly got commissioned and absorbed into the military. If we have those assets available, one, we can use them in peacetime, and then if we need to take them into conflict, they're going to have to change colors, and they're going to have to become military platforms with all of the guarantees that are associated with it. But I love the idea for now for the services to tap into KC-135s that are retiring and hand them over $1 an aircraft, whatever it is, and let them do the commercial-owned, commercial-operated thing. One, it's going to give us the assets we need to do the job today, and two, it would provide the buffer for the future. The only caution I would give to Meta and all of the other companies that are thinking about diving into this is you've got to have a reliable partner on the other side. And so the service, the Air Force, has been saying, we need red air, and we're going to commercialize this, and we're going to go in and tap out to all these companies. And this is something that we want you to plan for. And so you've had a bunch of entities go out and buy these aircraft overseas, convert them into viable platforms, and go out and start at least competing for operational contracts for Red Air. And now that idea is starting to go away. And so all of those companies that put the money into it are now basically looking at this going, what's going to happen to us? You said, Air Force, that you were going to use these, and it looks like you're changing your mind. The Air Force needs to be a reliable partner, and they need to actually put their money where their mouth is and hold to these ideas so that you don't have folks betting and taking a risk that you're risking on the wrong entity.
And it's worth noting, Meta is providing this service already. There's another company, Omega, that also provides that tanking. And yes, as you mentioned, JV, I think others are thinking of venturing into this space as well. Just to wrap up, I'd love to get each of your thoughts. Maybe we can start with you, JV, on sort of top priorities that you would try to communicate to the Department of Defense, Congress, as they're looking at the aerial refueling enterprise.
Yeah, so I've loved the discussion, and thanks for teeing it up. These guys are just the best in the business, and I love being on a panel with Todd and Gonzo, so thank you for that. This idea of going forward, numbers matter, and competencies matter. When we think about fielding tankers, the KC-46, the KC-Y that's supposed to follow it is supposed to have a huge comm suite, at least the faculties to build into it. If you go back to the fielding of the the C-17, when the C-17 was up for competition, Lockheed, I think they own the C-5. Lockheed offered one C-5 and two C-130s for the price of every C-17. And the Air Force said, well, you got to understand, the manpower footprint is going to decrease. We're going to decrease costs with the C-17. Now, the C-17 has been a great asset for us, but all of those manpower savings are actually not. When you go to combat, you've got to have the same number of crews that you had for the previous platforms for the C-17. And when I think about us doing the additive requirements in for everything from comm suites to potentially being weapons delivery platforms, those are all in the ethereal world right now. But these airplanes are air refueling assets. In a time of war, the cargo carriage capability is going to be minimal at best, as will the attributions and the contributions right now. Focus on numbers, focus on minimizing costs, and focus on fielding competency right now.
Thanks. Todd, please.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with what JV said there, and I think this has been a really great discussion. I always like chatting with you guys, my colleagues. But yeah, I guess a final point I would make is that the future of the tanker fleet, it's not one of the sexy areas that people like to focus on, even within the Air Force or on the Hill, but it is one of those key supporting enablers that all of those sexy assets, F-35s, B-21s, they're not going to be able to do their job without these kind of supporting assets. So it's really important, I think, for policymakers to focus on what do we need in that future fleet, because so much else is riding on it. And again, I would foot stomp the point. Not everyone agrees with it, but cost has got to be a consideration. It should not be a limiting factor. It needs to be a consideration. You've got to get realistic about what things are going to cost. And the Air Force, I think, has got to show that bill. They've got not just say, oh, well, we need this. They got to show the bill and say, this is what we need to support it. And if that means that the budget's got to grow, that Air Force aircraft procurement will have to grow and sustainably remain above Navy aircraft procurement for some period of time.
Oh, wouldn't that be something?
Wouldn't that be something? Yeah.
Crazy.
Then they need to make that case. And I think that there will be folks on the Hill that are supportive of that, if they go out and make that argument. But if they don't make it, then it's like in sports. You make 0% of the shots that you never take. I think it's that situation with the Air Force and their budget environment.
So, if I was a member of Congress, the first question I would ask the Air Force is, what is your operating concept for fighting China or Russia? I need to know that so I have a baseline to assess whether or not what we're doing on the Hill is going to provide you with the means you need to win America's wars. Second thing is, what force mix and capacity do you need to operate that way against America's adversaries? And finally, all right, how does that boil down to budget? What kind of resources, as you said, are needed to allow you to fight the way you think you need to fight in the future? I need to know that. The Air Force has to communicate those things to the Hill. Today, the force is budget driven. I'm all aboard for budget informed, cost informed, no question about that, but it is totally budget driven. And that is why our air refueling force, the Air Force that we have, is a high risk force today. And other elements of our military, frankly, are too.
Thanks, Mark. And thank you all for joining the discussion today. I've really enjoyed it. I think it's been a very rich discussion what we've had on these topics, and I think it's emphasized the fact that this is a critical area for the Air Force, but for DoD more broadly. Aerial refueling really is one of the U.S.'s strategic advantages. But unless we start to make some of these changes that we need in terms of surface infrastructure, how we base tankers, where we base them, and resource that in terms of the command and control systems that they need, the comms, and then obviously the tankers. The Air Force will need to, I think, make some very wise decisions in terms of what it does for KCY, and then start to spend the R&D dollars it needs to lay a path for KCZ that can follow that afterward. Thank you all for joining us today. And we look forward to having continued conversations on aerial refueling and national security priorities at Department of Defense. Have a good day.